Welcome to your second lecture in the Criminality, Psychopathology and Deviance module, in which today we're going to start looking at various different theories of criminality. So, some of the key issues we'll touch on as we go along include whether criminals are born criminal or whether they are made criminal, which would go to suggest that virtually anyone could be made criminal potentially, or as the former argument suggests, if you go down a more biological route, does there have to be a particular predisposition towards crime? Now, one of the issues we'll reflect on as we go is whether that argument, the nature-nurture argument, extends to all forms of crime or is more specifically relevant to certain forms of crime. Because clearly there is a huge difference between someone who shoplifts occasionally and a serial rapist. So one of them potentially could be born and the other one potentially could be made. It does not necessarily have to be the same theory which applies to every conceivable type of crime. The third option, of course, is that they neither are born nor made, but choose to become a criminal of one sort or another. That they are exercising their free will rather than being puppets of either their biology or their upbringing. Now, to start with the biological theories, a number of arguments are put forward, and we'll just look at them at a basic level today, because we can go over them in more depth in a future lecture. Biology, we know, contributes significantly to our appearance, particularly in terms of genetics. Will determine our hair colour, our eye colour, our average height, our tendency to be thin or to put on weight very easily, and so forth. All of those factors are determined genetically, and to some extent, as with whether you're thin or medium-sized or overweight, will also be determined by environmental factors such as what you eat and so on. Arguments are made in a whole raft of different areas of human psychology that certain mental predispositions may be more or less heavily shaped by similar factors, by genetic factors and potentially by environmental factors that have a biological input in the way that diet or drinking large amounts of alcohol or taking medication or illicit drugs can have in the long term on the human body. And this includes also looking at factors which are based in biology, although there are disputes as to whether the impact on criminality is primarily to do with genetic biological factors or is more to do with socialization and the way in which societies react towards people on the basis of their gender or their racial categorizations. So we can look at demographics of crime and discover that certain sorts of crime are more likely to be committed by men, and more likely to be committed by women, are more likely to be committed by this or that ethnic group. That in itself is a basis for an argument rather than an actual argument, because the actual arguments can be made by questioning. Let's say a particular ethnic group commits more car crime than any other ethnic group, for argument's sake. Now, do they do that because they are biologically disposed towards car crime, which would be a curious notion in itself? Or is it because of cultural factors, maybe the culture they come from places tremendous value on cars, or places comparatively little value on notions of property and ownership? Or is it because they are treated in a certain way by perhaps the police, the court system, and so forth, so that if a member of that ethnic group steals a car, maybe they are more likely to be arrested or more likely to be charged or more likely to be convicted than if a person from a different ethnic group steals a car. So it could well be that other ethnic groups are indeed stealing cars at a similar rate. They're simply not being caught, or if they are caught, they're treated differently, so perhaps they don't get a conviction and therefore they don't appear on government demographic statistics. All of these arguments are put forward, But which ones are correct, we will explore as we go along, and you can weigh up the evidence and decide for yourself where you feel the weight or evidence rests within those various different arguments. So we know that to an extent genetics has a role to play in the various factors you can see on the screen. Different psychologists with psychobiological and those from within other forms of psychological discipline will argue quite what the extent of that influence is. So is somebody's level of aggression determined 80% by biological factors and 20% by social factors, or is it 60-40, 50-50, 70-30? What is the actual nature and extent of the relationship? It's a difficult thing to prove one way or the other, and even if you could argue in the case of a few specific case studies, take 3 or 4 people and say for this person it's this ratio, for that person it's a different ratio, to what extent can you generalise from that handful of case studies out to the entire population of a country, let alone the entire population of the planet? That what is true of a small handful of people is therefore true of the vast majority of people. Difficult to argue, but these arguments still go on. And of course aggression levels do play quite a significant factor in a lot of crime. So whilst not everyone who is very, very aggressive will find themselves in prison, certainly a fair portion of the people in prison are there because of some crime, some action related to anger and subsequent violence. They may be there for GBH or ABH, or for murder or attempted murder or a variety of other crimes in which violence and aggression play a significant factor. Had they been not quite such aggressive people, would they have ended up in prison? So you can't say for certain that they wouldn't, but clearly a lot of people do speculate that aggression is a critical factor in landing people into prison. Not the only factor, but a critical factor. A not dissimilar argument is made around intellectual ability, such that, well, first off to say that the arguments are made that intellect might be understood as potentially flexible, so that people can stretch themselves and achieve more intellectually, academically, in various related disciplines, by applying themselves or by having support from really good teachers and so forth. But there are other arguments made that whilst you can stretch and improve, nonetheless biology places a glass ceiling on how far your intellect can stretch. So with an awful lot of help and input, you could be as clever as Stephen Fry, or as clever as Danny Dyer. I've no idea how clever he is, actually, just not an example there. So you may be able to reach a certain point, the argument goes, but not necessarily be able to go beyond that. Now, when studying, psychologists studying people with significant intellectual difficulties and learning disabilities, again, there is room for stretching and improving and learning more, being capable of more with the right levels of input and support. But there is a perhaps somewhat obvious ceiling beyond which trying to push that individual will simply make them desperately unhappy. And perhaps even turn into a form of bullying if you push and push and push somebody beyond their capacity to achieve. Is that only true of people with obvious overt learning difficulties, or is it fundamentally true for every single person on the planet? That our IQ level can go up so far, but no further. And perhaps in the opposite direction, it can drop so far, but no lower. Does intellect have a role to play in crime? Well, this argument has been made sometimes. And certainly if we look at literacy rates in prison, in British prisons, and obviously different countries have different rates, in British prisons the literacy rate is remarkably low. A very significantly large portion of the British prison population have a reading age below that of a 12-year-old. Now, We can understand this in a couple of possible ways. It could be that someone who struggles intellectually, academically, whether that's for biological reasons or social input reasons or what have you, might get more and more frustrated. They may well find it difficult to advance in life, particularly if they're not lucky enough to have an old school-time network to give them a foot up. You can perhaps think of some fairly prominent people who seem to have achieved what they have in life despite maybe having least dazzling of intellect. So sometimes a social network can compensate for lack of innate talent. And if you're not lucky enough to have the social network, then you're just lumbered with your lack of innate talent. And perhaps the resultant social frustrations, possible poverty from being in low-paid jobs, all of the issues that come with not being able to get as far ahead as an individual would like to get far ahead, could perhaps lead into a lot of crime. We could make a potential alternative argument that maybe the ones who are not the most intellectually adept are the criminals most likely to be caught and end up in prison. But the really clever, high-flying criminals get away with it, so they don't tend to appear in the prison population. So is it that the people who commit crime in general, whether they get caught or they don't get caught, have a tendency to a lower IQ and lower academic achievement, lower academic ability, or is it simply that the ones who get caught are in that situation, where the ones who don't get caught are possibly the bright ones, the adept ones, who are cunning enough to get away with their activities? So there is a potential role for intellectual ability to factor in to the likelihood of someone A, committing a crime in the first place, and B, getting caught for it, or getting away with it. Sexual appetites are argued again in terms of nature. And for the most part, those arguments tend to centre around whether being gay or straight or bisexual is something we are born. Is it genetic, for example, or down to bone structure? Mostly the arguments centre on genetics, more so than they centre on bone structure. Or is this something that comes about, as Freud argues, as a result of a particular style of upbringing that is more inclined to make you gay or more inclined to make you straight or bisexual, as the case would be? By and large, that's where the majority of the arguments settled. Now, up until the 1960s, that would have been partially an argument around criminality, because for gay men, simply having sex with each other was a criminal act in and of itself in this country, and remains so in certain parts of the world. These days, of course, that's no longer the case in Britain. But we could reflect on those sexual appetites which are likely to land somebody into a prison cell. So not the issue of whether you prefer men or whether you prefer women or whether you like them both, but the sort of criminal appetites such as paedophilia, necrophilia, bestiality. What about the interface between aggression and sexuality? Such that regardless of whether someone prefers men or women or what have you, are they the kind of individual who will take no for an answer if they get turned down, or will they persist and perhaps find themselves charged with sexual assault or rape or one of another variety of related crimes, because their aggression and their sexuality are so overlapped with each other that they don't appear to disengage, or at least not to the point where the rest of society can be safe from their desires and appetites. There is some research into the causations of paedophilia and necrophilia and so on, but comparatively little compared to the amount of research that goes into the causations of being gay, bisexual, or straight, which is frankly somewhat of a pity, because it would be done something more useful to know how to stop people being paedophiles than to have some argument to make about why this person is gay and that person is straight. If we were to temporarily put on a sociological hat we could wade into the murky realms of queer theory, which you will do in your third year, for those of you doing sociology, and question to what extent labels like gay and straight and bisexual are really very useful or very meaningful. Certainly a number of queer theorists and people who subscribe to some other types of theory as well, would suggest that arguments around whether your genetics or whether your parental upbringing causes you to like men, women or both is a largely pointless argument, because they don't tend to categorise people in that way, and will point to a lot of societies in which those labels are not relevant. Which isn't because people in those societies don't go and have sex with each other, but rather because they think of sexuality in very different terms. And the sex of the person you prefer to go to bed with is not a particularly important issue compared to other social factors, such as which social class they're from, or which tribe they're involved, may be deemed far more important than whether they're a man or a woman. Avariciousness is argued by evolutionary psychologists as having a benefit to our evolution. The distant ancestors, back in the days when we were all in caves, those who managed to hold food were more likely to survive than those who gave their food away willy-nilly, or just only ever took what food they needed on a day and weren't storehousing food for tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. So is the impulse to hoard a survival instinct, a hardwired genetic instinct? Evolutionary psychologists argue it is, and that the same impulse which might have led our distant Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon ancestors into hoarding nuts and berries and deer carcass and what have you, is the same basic genetic impulse that leads us today to hoard, well, in my case books, but in other people's cases maybe hoard money, or hoard jewellery, or hoard clothing, or whatever on earth it is that an individual person wants to have mountains and mountains of. And whilst the survival benefits of having a couple of thousand books piled up around your house are fairly low, although frankly they do work as insulation in the cold weather, as well as intellectual stimulus. Fairly low, but there's the same drives, and this is an idea in general in evolutionary psychology, that the same fundamental urge that leads you in a useful direction can sometimes lead you up a blind alley into doing something that's not terribly useful, but has the same basic underlying impulse or urge or hormonal drive at the root of it. And if we were doing this live in person, we could have a good discussion about this. And indeed we can have a discussion via the group chat later on as to what extent you feel biology is a key factor in criminal activity. Or indeed, if we were to stretch this argument to include discussions of mental illness. Is mental illness the result of underlying genetic issues? Is it the result of fluctuating neurochemicals, which may be driven around by factors like diet and the various substances we imbibe? Or is it the result primarily of life events? Perhaps being bereaved, for example, leading someone into a state of depression. Or is it a combination of all of the above? Different psychologists have different opinions on that one, again, as to what the ratio is. Is it 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, etc.? Now the chap here in the photograph is Cesare Lombroso, who back in the 1800s was an Italian criminologist and researcher, who conducted a variety of surveys and studies in Italian prisons, during which he measured various physiognomic features. If you're unfamiliar with the term physiognomic, that's just measuring someone's body, which, please don't read anything untoward in that. He wasn't that type of a researcher. So he was measuring noses and ears and foreheads and chins and length of arm and length of leg and all that sort of thing. And coming to the conclusion that there were certain body types which were more likely to be found in the prison population than in the general population. Why is this? Well, he argued that criminals are a bit of a kind of a primeval throwback to Neanderthal, to our early caveman or cavewoman selves. Sort of low foreheads, knuckles dragging on the ground, or that sort of slightly gorilla kind of a look that not mainly in villages around Suffolk, but occasionally you can see people who do look as if they might be much happier living in a tree. Those features, he said, are these atavistic primeval throwbacks to a different millennia of human existence. And that some criminals, these genetic patterns persist, because often you'll have families of criminals where not only is the youngest member of the family a criminal, but so is the parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents, going back to the year dot, have these criminal urges, which he tracked back to the arguments we've just had in the previous slide about hormonal inclinations to aggression and sexual, criminal sexual appetites and avariciousness, greediness, all of those sorts of things. These are sort of people who have a lot more in common with our ancient ancestors than with the rest of modern day humanity. There are counter-arguments that can be made to suggest why Lombroso found the features he did in the prison population, which have not necessarily anything to do with the conclusions he drew. And you may have your own ideas on this, or you might want to pause the video for a minute, have a coffee and contemplate before I tell you one of the possible answers. Assuming you finished contemplating and you've got your coffee, and are now restarting the video. The prison population, particularly back in the 1800s, in Italian prisons, and let's face it, most prisons the world over at that point in history, were not healthy places to be in. The quality of food provided for prisoners was very, very poor. They often spent very prolonged periods of time in their cells, not able to get outside, get fresh air, get sunlight, and a fairly sizable number, by far the majority of the people in prisons then, and indeed it's not much different now, came from the poor classes of society. They were working class or even underclass. So it wasn't simply malnourishment whilst they were in the prison. They had come from the kinds of families that were so poor, malnourishment was just a day-to-day feature of life, from infancy upwards. And as some of you will undoubtedly know, if you're malnourished for a prolonged period of time, you're likely to suffer all kinds of physical problems. Bone deformation, bad teeth, poor eyesight, very poor cognitive functions, as your brain, like every other organ of your body, is malnourished, so you're not thinking properly, thinking in the way that a fit, healthy person does, and your body shape changes as well as your mental function changes. Chuck into that people spending prolonged periods of time locked up in cells and not getting sunlight, then rickets and a variety of other issues can kick in, leading to, again, this sort of odd appearance. If we wish to be particularly scathing in some kind, if you live in a very, very impoverished family where there may be 15, 16 of you to a room, and you're so poor you have to share a bed, then it is not uncommon for incest to become a problem. Clearly, you can still have incest even if you're millionaires and living in a 25-bedroom mansion. But the more densely packed human beings become, the more opportunities there are for, what shall we say, unfortunate behaviours to take place. And inbreeding can indeed change appearance as well. So there's all sorts of things that could lead to people in prisons having a somewhat odd look about them. Was he comparing like for like? Was he comparing working class prisoners to free working class people in the general public? Or was he comparing them to nice middle class people when he was measuring body shapes and so on? So perhaps he was comparing the malnourished to the well-fed, and then not quite telling why one group of people looked significantly different from the other group of people. So what kinds of things did he come across? I've already sort of suggested this general slightly gorilla kind of a look. Very long arms, so the point of dragging knuckles on the ground. Large teeth. Earlobes missing, so ears without lobes. And that you can't really put down to diet, that's not a dietary factor. It is perhaps a factor of coming from a close family, a close community, being very hairy. I'm not going to make any comments on that. Sloping foreheads, all these sorts of, again, slightly gorilla-like appearances. Could be down to poverty, could be down to inbreeding, could be down to malnourishment and all of the issues that go with a very, very long-term unhealthy lifestyle. Or perhaps he was right. Perhaps there is an element of throwback to an earlier stage of human existence. Practically all psychologists these days would suggest the dietary and the inbreeding and the various other factors, rather than accepting this idea that the criminally inclined are somehow more like cavemen than they are like modern day people. It's not a very PC thing to say, and you could certainly respond to that with the issue of so what? Does the truth have to be politically correct? No, it doesn't. Something can be true and offensive and non-PC at the same time. If that's just a thing you have to live with. But he was a man thinking in a way that was commonplace in the era in which he lived and for the social class that he came from. And so his ideas have to be understood in that context, just as probably 100 years from now there will be people saying exactly the same about us. But their ideas were the result of their social class or their context or their era. You have to put it in context. And let's not try to laugh at how peculiar some of the ideas seem in the 22nd and the 23rd and whatever century it is they have to be, when we're sitting there looking back on our cutting-edge ideas of the 21st century. So some of the arguments we can think about and consider as we go on. This week it's basically just introducing and flagging these ideas up. We're not going to go into an enormous amount of detail yet. That will come in later part of your studies. So the biochemical arguments are around features that are flexible within our systems. So whereas neurophysiological arguments tend to be things like brain structure, and whilst your brain structure can change over a period of time, these are more longer lasting issues. And the evolutionary genetic arguments are also longer lasting issues. Your biochemistry can change on an hour by hour basis. Indeed, if you were to go and shove a large quantity of some iffy chemical into your system, it could change on a minute by minute basis, let alone on an hour by hour basis. So factors like diet, hypoglycemia, fluctuating hormones, which are always fluctuating, environmental exposure means to things like air pollution, radioactivity in the environment, factors which fluctuate as you move in and out of different environments, from home to work to the shops to wherever you go. We are exposed to things that we can both see and things that we can't see and possibly aren't even aware of there, but which are affecting our biological function. And again, we're at this key nature-nurture issue. To what extent do your biological functions extend to your mental capacities? I'm sure we're all familiar with days when we feel very wheezy and out of breath, and other days when we feel super energetic and bouncy. And that may be down to diet or been drinking or all sorts of other factors. As our bodies go good days and bad days, we're used to physical fluctuations and accounting for them in terms of biological issues. Biopsychologists put forward the argument that our mood swings, are we in a happy state of mind or a sad state of mind? Are we angry with someone or calm with someone? Has less to do with how they behave. In other words, we think we're angry because of them, it's therefore we're angry. The counter-argument could be made that the anger is being provoked by internal situations in our own body, fluctuating patterns of hormones and neurochemicals, and that the person we are blaming for our anger may be that they're largely innocent bystander who hasn't particularly done anything to make us angry. And that maybe on a different day we wouldn't feel angry with them at all. Or even a different hour on the same day we might feel angry with them at all. Because that anger is predominantly internal and biological, rather than provoked by the environmental stimulus by their behaviour in the first place. The Twinkie defence will mention briefly because it's a curious example. In America, going back a fair few decades ago, there was a mayor called Harvey Milk, who was the mayor of San Francisco for a while. There was a film made about him. I think it was just called Milk, actually, the film. I've not seen it. They made a film about him because he was the first openly gay mayor of any in America, and I think possibly anywhere in the world, but certainly anywhere in America. And so he became a bit of a kind of celebrity figure for a little while. Now, like any mayor, he had to make various political decisions, and some of his decisions were very popular, and some of his decisions were very unpopular. And one of his more unpopular political decisions led to a number of people being made redundant as their workplace was severely affected by budget cuts and that sort of thing. And one of the people who got made redundant then had various other problems, corollary problems, domestic issues with his wife. She chucked him out, all sorts of things like that, which he felt only happened because he'd lost his job. Now, I don't know enough about this man's private life to say whether his view of that was accurate or not, but suffice to say, he felt that not only had he lost his job because of Harvey Milk's political decision-making, but all of these other problems that were going on in his private life were also the kind of knock-on consequences of that decision, and therefore they were Harvey Milk's fault as well. And he got angrier and angrier and angrier. And eventually he went and shot Harvey Milk dead, assassinated him. And he was caught fairly quickly and hauled before the courts, and the defence made by his lawyer was that after his wife had given him the boot, he'd gone and lived in one of these dirt cheap motel rooms, which are usually dirt cheap because they're very dirty, grimy, awful places. The sort of place that gets rented by the hour by working ladies and no doubt the occasional working gentlemen as well. And there he'd been sitting in this grotty, manky, flea-bitten motel, drinking himself stupid and eating Twinkies by the crate load. If there's anyone in the class who doesn't know what a Twinkie is, by all means Google it when you get the time. But it's like a kind of really cheap American cake, but when I say cake, it's like a kind of I was going to say finger of fudge. It's a sort of marzipan type thing. It's a small cake, like the sort of thing you put in a kid's lunchbox. So we're not talking real cake, like fruit cake or something like that. We're just talking about a little kind of wrapped up thing, which is sugar, and a bit more sugar, and similar numbers and more sugar. So it's junk food of the junkiest type. And the lawyer's argument was that by spending several weeks getting tanked up on all of this junk food, sugar by the crate load, in eating however many umpty-hundred Twinkies he managed to get through in a few weeks. The sheer volume of sugar, chemical gunk in the food, and the alcohol in the lack of proper food and proper nourishment had caused the mental balance of the murderer's brain to tilt. So he was no longer thinking clearly. He was no longer in his clear, rational mind. He was in the sort of, I suppose it's almost like comparing kind of like a 6-year-old in a sugar rush, bouncing off the ceiling. So when he picked up his gun and went out and shot the mayor dead, he wasn't thinking clearly. And the jury bought it. And yes, he was convicted, but it could hardly not be. He had shot the mayor dead. It was a fairly open and shut case. But they bought the defence of diminished responsibility, that he wasn't thinking clearly. He was not exactly insane per se, but not in his right mind, as a result of all this sugary junky food he'd been eating. And he got a lighter prison sentence as a result. Now, like I say, many of you might know anyway, San Francisco has a very high gay population. It's like a sort of a go-to place for a lot of gay people, especially back in the 70s when all of this was going on. And so a large percentage of the population of San Francisco were up in arms about this and said they only let him off on a lighter sentence because the mayor was gay and had been straight, the murderer got a much stiffer prison sentence. But it was that kind of gay lives don't matter sort of attitude. And maybe they were right. I'm not familiar enough with American politics to know the ins and outs of the case at the time. In that respect, it's easy to imagine there may have been elements of that thinking going on anyway. But it caused some degree of controversy in America, both in the newspapers and in the court system, as to this idea that someone eating a ton of junk food is therefore in a diminished state of mind, so if they go and engage in a criminal act, they should get a lighter sentence. And I'm quite sure there's probably a few other people who tried it and decided, well, I'm going to murder my wife and my husband, so I'll just eat 55 Twinkies and then use that as my excuse to get a lighter sentence. But to the best of my knowledge, the Twinkie defence has never succeeded a second time in an American court case. Although there have been other court cases where people have got off, or at least had a reduced sentence on somewhat debatable grounds connected to the notion of there having diminished responsibility because of this, that or the other reason. But even though most of us probably don't sit there eating Twinkies till they come out of our ears, have you ever been in a state of mind where, as a result of eating unhealthy things or having a few pints too many, you have started to behave in a way where you are only partially aware of what you were doing? You were getting very excitable or very aggressive or very sad or very this, that, the other, and you were conscious, and perhaps the people around you were conscious, that your behaviour was getting quite odd compared to normal, and that was maybe a result of your very unhealthy diet. Or maybe you were on medication, and that medication resulted in you becoming a little bit odd, or a little bit peculiar in some way. I dare say we've all had some experience at some points in our lives of the impact of chemicals on our system, leading us to behave in ways that are not typical of how we are normally. Whether that's a defence for committing serious crime is an entirely other argument, but at least we are aware that these things can happen. Neurophysiological arguments more about brain structure look at, for example, what used to be called the psychopathy argument. We'll touch a little bit on that further this week and then again more in future weeks. The term psychopathy is not as popular as it used to be in the psychological circles. It's been replaced in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, which is the book used by psychiatrists when they're diagnosing mental illness, with the phrase APD, Antisocial Personality Disorder, which is almost the same thing as psychopathy, It's just got a different name to it. Similar arguments are made that there are individuals who are born possibly with genetic issues or possibly with brain structural issues, in that there are certain areas in their brain that do not appear to function as well, as effectively, and possibly not even at all in some cases, as a more healthy, fully functioning brain. And one of the areas that tends to lack function, to the same extent at least, is the area of brain most closely associated with empathy and the ability to engage in sympathetic feeling for other people or for animals, etc. To kind of empathise with people who are suffering, feel sorry for them, that sort of thing. Which is a classic feature of both the psychopathic personality, when that term is in vogue, and the antisocial personality disorder personality individual. That they are both people who feel very, very little, possibly none whatsoever, empathy for others. They can observe suffering and not be moved by it, not be upset by it, not so much as go, "ah," in that slightly condescending way we tend to do. They will watch it in a very sort of indifferent fashion, which doesn't guarantee you'll definitely want to go and cause suffering. But the argument is that the aversion most have to inflicting pain and suffering on others comes from the fact that we can empathise with people when we see them crying and shaking and begging for mercy and what have you. When we see someone in a state of pain, our primary reaction is one of empathy. But if you don't have that primary reaction, does that increase the likelihood that you will go and inflict suffering on others? The central argument says yes. There's more to it than just that. This is just kind of finding out and introducing these ideas. And the evolutionary theories argue that just as how hairy you are, or whether you're tall or short, and all that sort of thing, is down to a genetic evolutionary background, what has been effective and useful for your ancestors over the course of thousands and thousands and thousands of years, those physical features tend to persist. So the argument goes that mental behaviours, outlooks, attitudes, personality predispositions can also persist over a very, very, very long period of time, because for a large chunk of that time they have been advantageous to survive. Which doesn't always mean they are still, today, 21st century, advantageous to survival, but simply that they have been in the past. And can that include what these days would be labelled criminal activities? So the caveman, going back 90,000 years, who stole food from other cavemen and hoarded it in his cave, was he more likely to survive than a caveman who never stole anything and respected property rights, ownership of food and so forth? Obviously, it's remarkably hard to say one way or the other on that score without the benefit of the TARDIS. But an argument might be that light-fingered cavemen were more likely to get enough food and survive, unlike the people who eat the food, and that therefore a predisposition towards light-fingeredness and acquisitiveness of other people's goods could pass from generation to generation to generation. Whilst in the 21st century we're more likely able to make DVD players rather than food, it's the same basic primary drive, no matter the manifestation as to quite what it is being stolen. Similar arguments are made around aggression and violence, even around some sexual offences, which make for somewhat unsavoury reading, as he said. They are rather grim arguments, but at one point as we go along, when we get into the lesson where we're discussing sexual offences, we've got those arguments in a little bit more detail. Hopefully no one will be too put off by those arguments, because they are, as I said, rather grim, but they are made and could potentially be correct. They're not personal, but they could potentially be correct. So to flesh some of these arguments out a little bit more, one of the arguments made around psychopathy, particularly back when that was the term in vogue, was that psychopaths exhibited a very, very high level of masculine behaviour, and that includes female psychopaths as well. It has been argued that there are fewer female psychopaths than there are male psychopaths, significantly fewer, which could be because there are, indeed, not too many of them. Or, some people suggested maybe the women just get away with it, are less likely to be detected than the male psychopaths are. Again, difficult to know for certain on that basis. Testosterone, which is the chief of the androgens, the male hormones, is linked to a number of behaviours. Now, men have, well, most men, I should say, have high levels of testosterone. Some men much, much higher levels than others. Women also have a level of testosterone in their bodies, but just not normally anywhere near as much as men. Women who take anabolic steroids, because that's maybe the bodybuilding or something like that, start to masculinize. So they start to get more flat-chested, they start growing body hair in places they previously didn't have much body hair, and start to exhibit more masculine physical characteristics, as well as exhibiting more levels of physical aggression. So the research so far, again, we're keeping it general at the moment, going into more detail in future weeks, the research suggests that men more likely to be highly aggressive tend to have higher resting levels of testosterone. I say resting levels because testosterone peaks and troughs, like all other hormones. There are going to be days when you've got much more testosterone produced in your system and days when the level drops. And generally speaking, the older you get, the lower the levels get anyway. So, a link to aggression, that's both verbal aggression, shouting, swearing, threatening people, but also full-on physical aggression, belting people, and thumping them, kicking them, karate chopping them, and whatever else you do up to. Now, this is not to say that if you ran up to a random man in the street and injected him with a strong dose of testosterone, that within 2 minutes he's turned into the Incredible Hulk and start punching people. What it suggests is that the trigger for temper increases. So some people remain calm for a very long period of time before they get angry. Other people will get very angry over anything. It doesn't take much to set them off. So the higher level of testosterone an individual has, the more easy they are to set off in terms of their getting angry. But again, that doesn't guarantee that they will beat somebody up. It means they'll get more and more annoyed, that they'll start looking at people in a very stroppy, angry way, they may start to verbalise and go, "Oi, you, not you spill my beer," and all that kind of thing. They might then tip over into physical violence. But the emphasis on the word might, because this is not some simplistic thing where take an injection, you will definitely get angry and beat people up. It doesn't work like that, because that would remove all sense of personal responsibility from individuals who could then just tell us, "Oh, it's not me, it's my hormones that are making me do this." It's not a clear-cut argument. This is a much, much more complex argument as to how not just testosterone, but all hormones interact within the system and how they link to behaviour. Blood testosterone, testosterone can be measured in different fluids in the body. So high levels of blood testosterone tie to high levels of aggression. Now again, we are somewhat stymied perhaps by the certain forms of research. So the example you've got there from Jacobson, she did her research back in 1965 up in Scotland. Again, she was looking at a captive population of inmates, people who had been caught, who were living in prisons, which are quite odd environments to live in. Can lead to all sorts of confrontational behaviours between prisoners and between officers and prisoners. There's perhaps a lot more swaggering that goes on in prisons than goes on outside of prisons. A lot more need to establish pecking orders and hierarchies of power, which are often established through acts of aggression. Mouthing off or beating somebody up or being just generally horribly unpleasant and so on in order to establish dominance over them. So when we're looking at research conducted in prisons, are we looking at a rather skewed population, which is not very reflective, perhaps, of ordinary people out on the streets, going about their daily business? Worth looking at the nature of research in this area to see who is it that they are testing and evaluating and conducting these sorts of research projects with. High testosterone coupled with low levels of serotonin in the brain key into this physically aggressive behaviour. Serotonin is one of the substances in the brain associated with happiness, kindness, jollity, a kind of joie de vivre, a love of life, a sense of enjoyment. Happy people are very rarely aggressive. Happy people don't normally go around battering those around. I dare say there's probably an exception to that somewhere in the world, but by and large people who are happy and smiling and laughing and jolly are not angry and violent and aggressive. So it's too little of the one and too much of the other is the combination that seems to be linked to violence, but only linked. So this is a correlation, not a causation. We can't say it makes people violent, only that it correlates with patterns of violence. So returning to Jacobs, she not only looked at testosterone and various factors like that in business, but she conducted chromosomal testing. Now, most men have XY chromosomes. That's what defines being a man. In the first place, what gives you a male body, but you have the XY chromosome. A tiny number of men have XYY, an extra Y chromosome. It is a very small one. And her argument was, of the male prisoners she looked at, those who did have the XYY chromosome had not only ended up in prison, usually almost always for a very, very violent offence, but also had a track record of violence whilst inside the prison, beating up other prisoners, attacking guards and so forth. Were very kind of macho, alpha male types. She used the phrase super male. They were as macho could be. And she felt that that was down to the XYY chromosome. You could attempt to account for it by the more sort of social factors of living in a prison, wanting to be top dog and the kind of behaviours you would need to engage in to become top dog. But Jacobs' counter-argument would be those men who didn't have the XYY chromosome didn't want to be top dog in the first place. So what is fueling what in this occasion? Queries have been raised since the 60s with other studies about just how prevalent XYY is, and also studies conducted with members of the general public rather than with prison populations, because clearly not everyone with XYY is in a prison. And questions raised as to how super male, how aggressive, how swaggering and macho XYY men are when they're in the general public, rather than necessarily when they're in prison. So there have been queries that maybe she might have, Jacobs might have leapt to the wrong conclusion too quickly, because she wasn't looking at a broad enough population of people, comparing inside and outside prison. Because she was only looking at the confined population of the prison, she perhaps read too much into her research and came to a conclusion that doesn't really pan out when you look at the wider population of the country. So, moving into Sigmund Freud, and just as sort of a brief recap of some of his ideas with regard to criminality. He says that we are born with these two fundamental urges circulating around within our id, which will instantaneously flash back to first year and remember that the id is that unrestrained, animalistic, infantile self that we're born with. It's there from the get-go, which has no capacity for self-restraint, no capacity for self-control. It screams and bawls and gets hungry and gets angry and gets all these kind of basic biological, animalistic-like urges, and once them satisfied the instant it has it. I feel as if I'm a little unfair to animals and so animalistic, because when my dog wants to go to the toilet, he scratches the door, he doesn't just instantly pee on the floor, whereas the id would just pee on the floor. It wouldn't scratch the door to say, I need to go out. It would just go there and then, no matter what. So a little bit more like the lack of bodily control seen in the baby than necessarily the capacity for bodily control seen at least in some animals, if not in others. Now, what are these two primary drives here? You may be asking if you've not encountered these terms in your reading around. Eros and Thanatos are named after two Greek deities. Eros, the god of love, and Thanatos, the god of death. The Eros drive is not just love in the romantic Mills and Boon sense of the term. Eros is the desire to care, to nurture in any way, friends, family, pets, lovers, any act of kind of caring, nurturing, bonding to, but also wanting to create, wanting to be artistic, paint pictures, write poems, bake cakes, embroider cloth, or whatever kind of creative thing that a person might want to get up to. It's the wish to create, to nurture, to love, to express. It's all those nice upbeat things. And perhaps most bedrock of all is the wish to live. And live in a really qualitative sense. Really feeling alive, not just scraping another growth, but really feeling alive in a deep and meaningful sense. And to allow others to do the same. Thanatos is the urge to death, to destroy. And Freud says it both internalises and externalises. So when it externalises, it's the urge to smash up other things, to sling a plate against the wall and smash it, to go and put a sledgehammer through a piano, which apparently is a thing you can pay to do these days, to brick a window. So to destroy things, destroy objects, but also to destroy other living beings, to go hunt and shoot and fishing and kill animals, to kill another human being, to just smash up, destroy, ruin, vandalise, polish off the things around us and the creatures and the people around us. When it internalises, goes inside, it's also the wish to self-destroy, to harm oneself, whether full-on suicide or a more slow form of self-destruction, which you could argue someone, let's say, with a severe eating disorder is slowly destroying themselves, someone with a major drug addiction or alcoholism is slowly destroying themselves. People who cut themselves aren't per se destroying themselves, because you can go and live in that, but they are engaging in an act of self-harm, so that too would come under the Thanatos urge, the urge to harm, the urge to destroy, the urge to damage. And Freud said we all have this urge towards our own death. In French it's called the appel de vide, the call of the void. If you've ever stood on a very, very, very tall building on the roof and you've looked over the edge, assuming if you've ever had this fleeting impulse in your mind, what would it be like to jump? That's the appeal to void, the urge to the void. If you've ever stood on a train station and the train is roaring towards you, and some little quiet voice in the back of your head says, what would it be like to jump in front of the train? Then that is the call to the void as well, that impulse to death and destruction. We all have it. So this is not something peculiar to criminals, this is something everyone has. Which one dominates in an individual, eros or thanatos? It's down to a combination of upbringing and your own personal choices that you make as you go through life. And at one point in your life, maybe eros is more dominant, and at another point in your life, maybe thanatos is more dominant. But Freud said that people who engage in crime, particularly very destructive crime, where they're vandalising things, smashing them up, or where they're attacking other people or murdering them or doing whatever horrible things that they do, are people succumbing to the thanatos drive, overwhelmed by the urge to destroy, rather than to nurture and look after, which is the eros drive. The id, that lack of self-control, eventually is reined in most people by the time you get to roughly the age 5 or 6, by parents teaching you self-control. Don't do this, you must do that. You hear that voice so often that it starts to internalise. Once it internalises, then you have a superego. You have a moral conscience, a voice within you that says, yes, I know you want to go and pee on the floor right now because you're desperate, but you must wait until you can find the toilet. Or, yes, I know this lecture is so boring you want to fall asleep, but you must wait to the end of the lecture before you can go somewhere quiet and fall asleep there instead. So it's that voice that tries to regulate what you do and control what you do. So the urges are still there, but they're now repressed or controlled or restricted in some way. At least they are if you have parents who are good at socialising. If you don't have parents that are good at socialising, then you end up with a very weak, possibly even non-existent superego. So when you get those id impulses that say, do this, do the other, you don't have the inner voice saying, no. And that is the key difference between the criminal and the law-abiding citizen, is that the law-abiding citizen does have that inner voice that says no. So everyone has the urge, the impulse to do destructive, dishonest things, but most people have the voice that restrains them. Criminals are the people who don't have the voice to restrain them. They give into it, into those impulses. So they end up sometimes getting caught and engaging in various criminal acts that land them in the clinic. So Freud went on to suggest that there are a number of defence mechanisms, coping strategies, which can potentially lead us to a life in prison. But that a life in prison may itself be quite appealing to some people for a number of different reasons. It kind of draws them in and makes them want to deal with that. One of them is regression. Regression, bearing in mind from your first year, Freud listed 30 odd different defence mechanisms. Regression is only one of them. Regression is where you want to go back to a childlike state, at least for a while, if not forever, because you feel safer there. You can, this phrase that is very popular in the 21st century, for instance, of adulting, that is too hard to go adulting, I can't cope with anything anymore. I've seen people on social media saying that. Sometimes adult life is difficult, we all know that. And sometimes you want a day off from it, or a week off, or a month off, or a year off from it. For some people that might involve going and visiting their favourite grandparent who pats you on the head and treats you as if you were still 10 years old. For other people, that might involve putting on some nostalgic DVD of a programme you used to like when you were a kid, and you can sit there for how long it lasts, and regress. You can kind of remember those nice things of being a kid again. For some slightly curious people, it involves putting on that when pretending they're 6 months old and being looked after in various ways that don't bear thinking about. For other people, and this is where we get back onto the criminal thing, Freud said being in prison is somewhat like being a child, in that there's somebody to cook for you, somebody to wash your clothes for you, somebody who tells you when to go to bed, somebody who tells you when to get up. You are controlled in the same way that a child is controlled. The prison wardens, the prison governor, are kind of like father figures, or mother figures as the case may be. They watch over you and tell you what to do and how to do it and when to do it and all the rest of it. So for as long as the prison sentence lasts, you are in this somewhat childlike state. And you don't have to go to work, you don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to negotiate emotional dramas with your husband or wife or your kids. You don't have to make responsible decisions for the whole family. You just do as you're told in the prison system. Yes, there's a dark side to it, all of the violence and gruesomeness that goes on in prisons. But for Freud, people who commit crime, and he was somewhat interested in the idea of sloppy criminals, the ones who leave fingerprints and bloodstains and all the rest of it, which means they get caught very, very easily. He said, do they actually deep down want to be caught? These aren't the criminal masterminds who get away with crime for 30, 40, 50 years. These are the people who commit it on one day and get arrested the next because they're so rubbish at it. They leave a trail and they get caught. Do they want to be caught? Do they want to regress to this childlike state? Or, one of his other arguments is that perhaps deep down they feel supreme guilt. Guilt connected to something in their childhood, their very early childhood. And they want to be punished. And because they've never been punished for that thing in their childhood, they engage in adult behaviours that will get them punished for something else instead. And so the punishment they get for robbing a shop or whatever it is that they've done goes partly to releasing the guilt they feel for whatever it is that went on in their childhood. Some people these days find that a less than convincing argument, although there are a fair number who go with the idea of prison as regression, as a form of regression. Another defence mechanism is displacement, where someone has an intense emotion they feel to one person, but are unable for whatever reason to express it towards that person. And so they divert that emotion to a much safer target. So the individual who is very, very angry with, let's say, their boss, or their mother, or father, or some other authority figure, and they can't vent their anger at the authority figure. So instead they vent it at an easy target. For some people that may just be shouting at the dog when they get home. But for other people it may be beating up a stranger in a pub who spilt their pint. And that's what lands them in prison. They have vented their anger on a random stranger, or on maybe their own children, or their own husband or wife, who they see as a soft target. Or maybe they've slung a brick through a window in an act of rage, not against the person who owns the window, but against the world, the universe, whatever it is that they're angry at, and it's a lashing out. So crime can also, Freud said, be understood as this lashing out process. Megagy went on to look at some research cases of people who bottle up their anger, bottle up their rage, like this 11-year-old who stabbed his brother multiple times, despite always having been a very quiet boy, a very gentle boy, with no obvious history of aggression. So Megagy says that if you bottle it up too much, and you press your emotion, you press your anger, which is very Freudian thing to do, then one day it will bubble over, it will explode out in this huge shower of rage and anger. And so there may be cases where the crime is committed by someone who is just the final straw that broke the camel's back, and a lifetime's worth of built up emotion comes erupting to the surface in a grandiose crime that's disproportionate to the situation. Erikson, who you can see in the photograph there, developed stage theory. He started out influenced by Freud and then kind of moved away from Freud. He said Freud was too obsessed with childhood, didn't take adulthood enough into account. And if you look at the whole of adult life from birth through to great old age, you can see 8 stages of life that people move through. And at each stage of life there is a different challenge to be faced. We won't go over all 8 now because we can get there. But one of the challenges in the adolescent stage is identity versus role confusion, which is the teenagers find themselves, or they fail to find themselves. They're trying to get a sense of who they are away from their parents, from their family, establish a separate sense of identity, a sense of individuality. And some of them, hopefully the majority of them, succeed eventually. They might change hair colour 35 times in the course of their teenagers, but eventually they find a sense of who they are. Some people do not find a sense of who they are. In fact, they lose any sense of who they are and descend into role confusion and chaos, where they've got no clear notion of who they are. Partly because some of them might hit booze and drugs, and the chemical impact robs them of any sense of clear boundaries. But also perhaps because they become very pliable, very bullyable, and they'll join gangs or get tied up with domineering personalities who boss them around and get them to do things, so they turn into a kind of a doormat and are exploited and taken advantage of because they feel that the domineering person provides them with the identity they can't quite work out in themselves, which is not an ideal situation to be in. And that doesn't always lead to crime, of course, but it could easily do so if the more domineering personality is proven in crime. Another psychologist, Marcia, took Erikson's ideas and added elements to them. Marcia's main interest is the teenage years and adolescent development, whereas Erikson was interested in the entirety of the lifespan. So Marcia says there are 4 main stages that teenagers go through. Foreclosure is when you live, and I don't want this to sound as negative as it does, but I can't think of a better way of phrasing it at the moment. You live in the shadow of your parents. So your parents have always told you who you are, what kind of person you are, what you should be doing in life, etc. And you go on living with that perhaps longer than you should do. Then you go through a period of diffusion where you start loosening the ties to parents and you're not quite sure who you are or quite what you are, and everything's a little bit unclear. Which is an awkward stage to go through, but so long as you go through it, you'll be okay. Not everyone manages to come out the other side. Some people get trapped in that for a long, long time, which can lead to rather schizophrenic-like states in the long term. Then you go through a period of moratorium where you're experimenting with different forms of identity. Changing hair colour, changing fashion sense. One day you're a goth, the next day you're an emo, the next day you're something else again. Chopping and changing in and out and that. Experimenting, which again is, as a short-term thing, is okay. If you are still doing that when you're 35, then you've got problems. But as a short-term, trying on identities, trying on different hats, getting clearer idea of who you might be by trying different things out, that's fine. As a short-term. And then finally, most adolescents get to achievement when, having tried on 35 different personalities, they work out which one is them, is the right one, and they become themselves. And are they usually happy, stable, well-adjusted people because they know who they are and where they're going and are doing the rest of it. Other theorists have been quite inspired by Marcia and suggested that sometimes this not only happens in adolescence, but you can have a mini version of this in middle age, so basically a midlife crisis, where kids are offhand, possibly divorce or bereavement, issues like that, and people start to question themselves and their identities and who they are, where they are, what they are. And there can be a sort of a miniature version of this that forms a midlife crisis as well. The criminal element comes in during both the diffusion and the moratorium stage, where teenagers are experimenting in uncertain, losing boundaries, and they're easily open to exploitation by domineering personalities, or trying on a sense of self which turns out to be a very unfortunate sense of self, a somewhat criminally inclined sense of self. And maybe they don't quite get through it as well as they ought to. So we've sort of gone through all of this as already just explained this to you, but if you wanted to pause this a little bit to jot down the notes or whatever, feel free. We've basically gone through that. The ideal state to get to the happy state is the last one, is achievement. And most people, as I said, do get there. Might take them long, but they do get there. Something to think about, and we'll discuss this next week when we've got the live class. Now this, I have no idea who this woman actually is. She's just some random photo I looked at the internet. But I'm going to pretend that she's Elizabeth. And that she's 25 years old. She's been a goth for roughly 10 years now. And she's done music and dress, and Lord knows how much money she spends on makeup and clothing. But she's the full-on business. And of late, she's also started to sample human blood. So she started just by sipping a small cut, a tiny cut on someone, all of which is given voluntarily by fellow people, fellow goths presumably, who are also into the blood drinking process, so she's not attacking anyone or anything like that. But she's now migrated from the odd little sip through to a glass one. Let's hope it's a shot glass, not a glass one. But she's drinking more of it anyway. And the question I want you to think about, and tell me your answer next week, tell me your answer to, is Elizabeth completely normal? And in this culture, so I know there are cultures in the world, tribal cultures, where blood drinking is more common, but she isn't a member of one of those tribal cultures. So she's British. Is she normal in Britain? Is she a deviant? Is she a criminal? Or is her behaviour, and I'm more thinking of blood drinking than the clothing and using it as tissue, is she pathological? I.e. mentally ill? How do you understand her blood drinking? Interesting to hear your views on that one. Now we'll skip briefly around Albert Bandura. There he is, in his younger days, looking all very jolly. Hopefully you'll remember his experiments with Bobo doll, which went over in the first year, where kids would watch some rather odd-looking woman playing with a Bobo doll, and sometimes she'd play quietly with it, and sometimes she'd knock 7 shades out of it, and then the kids were allowed to go to the same room with all the toys in that the woman had been in, and they pretty much did whatever they'd seen the woman do. So if the woman had been acting quietly, playing nicely, the kids would play nicely, and if the woman had been punching the dolly, the clown doll, then the kids would go and punch the clown doll. Bandura came to the conclusion that children learn monkey see, monkey do. If they observe criminality, they will engage in criminality themselves. If they see peaceful behaviour, they'll engage in peaceful behaviour. So, does this work in every single case? Well, we know, kids who grow up in very violent homes become very violent adults, but there are also kids who grow up in very violent homes who do not become violent adults, who become very gentle adults. So it doesn't work in every single case. And Bandura was quite aware of that. And so he wanted to know, why do some children imitate such behaviour whilst other children resist it? And he broke that down into stages and said, first off, the child has to be aware of the arousing event. In other words, you have to see the event in order to imitate it. You can't imitate something you haven't seen in the first place. Then they have to see it often enough to learn a set of skills. And we can call it a set of skills in a broad sense. So they learn to see their parents using drugs on a regular basis. They learn to see their parents battering each other on a regular basis. They learn to see the parents robbing homes and coming over with the stolen goods on a regular basis. They learn how to do it. And in the case of aggression, they learn how to be aggressive. They must see that behaviour as being rewarded in some way. So the burglaring parents, if they sell off their stolen goods and live high on the land on the acquired money, that's a reward. So the kid sees the benefit of that. If they see their dad thump their mother and their mother goes and does whatever the dad has ordered, or indeed vice versa, then what they see is not only someone being violent, but they see them getting their own way because they're violent. I.e., they see that the violence works. It is an effective tool to get what you want in life. If the dad thumps the mum and she picks up a throwing pan and thumps him back again, and no one gets what they want, then it's not succeeding. So it may be kids in some families see violence, but they see unsuccessful violence. Whereas kids in other families see violence that achieves the goal it sets out to achieve. And the violent person gets whatever it is that they want. The pro-violent values are an area where Bandura starts to basically agree with the ideas of Edwin Sutherland. But it's not just a set of skills, how do I do this activity? It's also a set of attitudes and values or concepts that say this is a good, desirable activity to do in the first place. So not only do you know how to do it, but you're also encouraged to want to do it, to think it's okay to thump someone, or at least to thump a certain type of person. It's okay to rob a house. It's okay to sell crack. It's okay to do whatever the thing is. And so it's the values that are absorbed. And once we get on to talk about feminist criminology, we can also factor in that it's not necessarily only family that pass on values. It may be the wider neighbourhood, gangs in the neighbourhood, that sort of thing, but also mass media can pass on values. And certainly a lot of feminist criminologists make the argument that physical and sexual violence towards women might well be fueled by things they've seen in their specific family, but that the mass media sexualises women. Half-naked women draped over the bonnets of cars, all that sort of thing in adverts. It's not a wholly convincing argument because, of course, millions upon millions upon millions of people see those adverts, and the vast majority of them don't go around raping and assaulting people. Only a tiny number of people go around rape and assault. Why do they do it when all of the other people don't? But you could see it as a contributory factor, even if it's not a central causative factor in attitudes towards whole sectors of society, entire demographics, whether that's attitudes to women or attitudes to a particular ethnic group, or attitudes to gay people back in the day when gay bashing was a lot more common than it is nowadays. Where do these attitudes come from? Is it just the family, or is it from a much bigger picture? Something to know. Okay, so placing this into some degree of context, we've kind of touched on the idea of issues seen and observed and learnt from in the family, and also started to think about this idea of the local subculture is essentially your neighbour. So your family might be really nice, but you live in a rough neighbourhood, and it's the neighbourhood gangs that start to influence the child or the teenager when they get roped into that, and then that takes on a whole kind of dominance issue of its own. But also we've touched a little bit on this notion of cultural symbols. So how are the potential victims of a crime seen in wider society, TV, film, books, newspapers, etc., etc. If the type of victim that a particular criminal tends to target is seen in a frequently negative way, is it any surprise that this person treats them badly? But again, as already said, it doesn't really explain why all of the other multimedia people exposed to the same mass media culture don't go and engage in appalling or dodgy behaviour. What keeps them safe whilst a tiny number of people succumb to the horrible attitudes? That's something that needs exploring in much greater detail. The other key factor that Bandura emphasised, and partly this is to do with how effective is a tool is the criminal behaviour, the violence, whatever it is, how effective is it as a tool. But Bandura says that the child has to see the model, whether that's mum, dad, brother, sister, next door neighbour, whoever it is, to see that role model as someone they want to copy. If you see them as a horrible, dreadful person who hate and don't want to be anything like, then you're not liable to try and imitate that behaviour. So the child has to think, yes, I want to be like dad or mum or the mafia godfather who lives down the road or whoever it is that they want to be like. They have to have that wish to be like them. And that's where we could say Bandura starts to really overlap into cognitive psychology and indeed humanistic psychology to a point where we're not simply seeing people as monkey see, monkey do in a mindless kind of fashion. We're starting to realise that people exercise free choice. They have 50 role models to choose from, but they only imitate certain ones. The majority of role models they probably ignore, or even avoid and do the dead opposite. What leads to that selection process? That's not something that Bandura himself goes into in a great deal of detail, so it's something you can think about. Other people have thought about other issues to do with social learning, such as Glock and Glock. They talk about inconsistent and harsh punishment. So if you've got parents who you do a thing today and they pat you on the head and do the same thing tomorrow and they kick you down the stairs, you never know where you are. It's inconsistent. And it's very unpleasant to be raised in an inconsistent environment. Especially so for children who lack the full cognitive grasp of what's going on in the world. But even for an adult, let's say you're a prisoner in a prison, and the treatment of prisoners there is very inconsistent. That also is very difficult to deal with. And so you never know where you are, and therefore you're not likely to form strong social bonds, because you don't know what the regimes are, because they try and change so much. And some people, it could be argued, do that deliberately. Very, very abusive partners could be intentionally nice one day and intentionally nasty the other, in order to keep their victim uncertain and doubtful and insecure and not knowing what is going on from one to the next. The harshness of the crime, if the reactions you get are totally disproportionate to the nature of the crime. A child steals a Mars bar and the parent batters them unconscious, totally disproportionate. Then again, the child is likely to manifest as they get older into teenage years, antisocial behaviour, delinquency and lashing out, and to a point at least imitating the same erratic levels of violence that the parent is manifesting. Patterson, likewise going on to 2002 there, says effective parenting needs to be much more pro-social, much more consistent, knowing what your kids are getting up to, monitoring them, using proportionate punishments rather than brutal ones, and also using proportionate rewards. So some parents use excessive rewards, and that's just as bad. Everything needs to be in proportion to the behaviour that has inspired it or led to it. That's much more likely to produce teenagers and then young adults who are well-adjusted, well-behaved, pro-social, nice to be around, kind, stable people. Can't all be put down to parenting, there are other factors as well, but parenting is a massive key to it. At least in his thesis point of view. We'll draw towards a close with Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg put forward ideas around childhood moral development. We'll look more at him as we go along in the course, that get a bit tasty. He said, youngsters from a very young age we go through stages of moral development, encouraged by parents, by the vicar, by the scoutmaster, by teachers, by mass media, all sorts of influences help shape, develop, progress our morality. And the more support we get, the higher up this pyramid of moral development we will get. But some people can become adults and still be stuck at a childlike moral stage. Not because intellectually they are severely disabled or anything like that, but rather because even if their intellect has developed, their morality has calcified, it's stayed fixed at a point because it has not been encouraged to move beyond that. Indeed, it may be actively encouraged to stay where it is by wider social factors. The bit there about delinquency, it just points out that you can behave in a very antisocial way without being immoral with it at the same time, because it depends on why you're being antisocial. So you could almost say that Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, is being exceedingly delinquent, and not to say outright criminal, but doing it for strongly reasons, to help the desperately poor and to take it away from the corrupt and the wicked and so forth. So there are examples of what the American philosopher called civil disobedience, where you see the law as corrupt, and so you become delinquent or criminal because you place a higher value on a moral issue than you do upon a legal one. But we'll get on to more of that in future weeks. So very quickly, the stages you've got here are very early childhood. You start by associating goodness with obedience. I have to do this because my mum told me to. I mustn't do that because my dad told me not to. Probably with no idea why you've been told. You just know you've been told, and that's good enough. That's all you need to know. So there's no greater inside life standing there. Your mum said, dad said, or the king said, the queen said, the president said, whoever else said. Doing something because a person in authority has told you to. You're worried about getting caught if you don't. Stage 2, still sort of like that, but beginning to take more self-interest and think, what is good for me, what makes me feel good is good, what makes me feel bad is bad. So not just what upsets mum and dad, but what makes me feel good and bad starts to take on a moral quality, without necessarily fully understanding the needs of others, except, if I'm nice to my sister, she's nice to me. If I'm horrible to my brother, he's horrible back to me, so I won't do it. And so what's good for others is only of interest if there is some kind of gain to you in the process. Again, usually for most people that's early childhood. Third stage is where friends and the wider social circle and wanting to look good in the eyes of that social circle become a factor. If my friends say it's good, it's good. It's okay to lie if you're lying to protect a friend. It's okay to do this if it's for a friend. And so loyalties to the wider group, not just authority, but the wider group, become as a measure of what is right and wrong. Looking good in their eyes and trying to help them, even if not what's happening. Stage 4 is where someone is getting to the point of understanding law in a much bigger, broader context. So usually this is kind of teenage, early adult years for most people. Taking on board responsibilities, duties, being a good citizen, trying to do the right thing by other people, and understanding that big social groups are often very complex with very sophisticated laws and grey areas. It's the bigger picture. Stage 5 is the awareness of common good, that sometimes law isn't all it's cracked up to be. And so sometimes you have to do things that might be illegal against the rules, but you bend them for a greater moral good. The good of the individual, which has potentially been, it has been critiqued by psychologists from other parts of the world to say that this is a very individualistic, very westernised, very Americanised point of view, the emphasis on individualism and individual rights as such a big issue. Finally, stage 6, this is the kind of Jesus Buddha level of profound moral goodness, of not needing law because you embrace moral principles at the universal level. Universal truth with a capital T, justice with a capital J, and you put the good of the many, no matter what the local law says, you put the good of people forefront as being terrifically important. Not many people get to that, but we can go over that later. Rational choice theory proposes, this is an idea chiefly from Wilson and Bernstein, and a few other people in this area of research. They chiefly put that humans are rational, at least most of the time they're irrational, And when they are engaging in any activity whatsoever, they will weigh up what they want to get versus what it's likely to cost them. Now, the cost could be money, how much you have to pay. It could be time or effort, or what will other people say, what will other people think. All sorts of different ways of evaluating the cost. But everything we get in life costs us something. So you make the choice. Is it worth the effort? If the answer is yes, you're going to do it. If the answer is no, you probably won't. And crime is no different from anything else. So somebody goes into a shop and see a really expensive bit of jewellery, and I think, is the shopkeeper going to notice if I steal it? What's the cost to me? Well, I might need to run out of here like close to avoid being caught. I need to do this, I need to do that. What's the gain? The expensive jewellery. If they feel that they won't get caught, that the cost is not a 5-year prison sentence, because they think they get away with it, then they're quite likely to do it. Whereas if they think, no, I think I probably will get caught, I don't think it's worth a 5-year prison sentence, then they probably won't do it. Now, those rational choices are based upon the level of information available at the time. And the amount of information we have is not always as good as it could be. So people who make seemingly stupid decisions may be doing, it's not that they themselves necessarily are stupid, but perhaps the information they were acting on was incomplete or wrong, or they just hadn't grasped the complexity of the situation. And had they understood the situation better, they might have made a totally different decision. So criminals are people who act either very, very calculatingly or act in a ill-informed way on rather misleading evidence, and do daft things that might result in them getting arrested later. We'll come back to rational choice theory as we go. Next week, when we're in person, we'll be looking at more theories around the development of criminal habits and patterns, and considering a few demographic issues. I've sent an email around about, sorry, not an email, an announcement on Workspace, about a discussion of this at 11 a.m. on Monday, just for an hour or so. If you've got questions you'd like to discuss, we can do it there. If you're completely happy with everything I've said and don't feel you need to discuss anything, fair enough. But if you would like to bounce ideas around with other students or ask me for greater clarification, that's when we'll do it. I apologise for this being a little bit rushed, but I've got to record a couple of more things today, and there's only so many hours in the day, so that's why this is a little bit rushed. Hopefully next time I do a recording it will be more leisurely. Yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see at least some of you in the live chat. Take care.